Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I hope there are a good number of people tuning in here through our YouTube channel to this meeting. It's a stakeholder workshop for the EPA-funded Phenograss project. And the title of this evening's webinar is Changing Climate, Changing Grasslands. It's a webinar about grass-based agriculture in a warmer and wetter Ireland. My name is Anya Murray and I'm the facilitator here this evening. And we have an excellent lineup of speakers who are each going to give us very short presentations of 5 minutes, talking about all the different aspects of how soils and grass growth and other aspects of our grass-based agricultural system in Ireland will be changing in a warmer, wetter climate. We have had today the IPCC report has come out with very stark warnings, once again, even starker, about the challenges that will be posed by climate change, extreme weather events increasing in frequency, new pathogens and diseases. But we're going to also look at how agriculture can offer solutions by carbon sequestration, integrating procedures that enhance carbon fixation and improving crop resilience as well. So in this symposium, we'll be discussing all of those issues. For the first half hour, we'll have a number of short presentations, and then we're going to have a good 45 minutes of a panel discussion, and we'll have a few additional panelists joining us as well from academics and industry stakeholders. So I would like to hand over to John, who's been, I think, managing the whole Phenograss project. That's John Yearsley in the UCD School of Agriculture and the Earth Institute as well. And John is going to say a few words just to welcome us and introduce us. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Anya. And welcome everybody on behalf of the Phenograss project. So I'm just going to say a few words of introduction. So the Phenograss, let me just get my presentation working. So the Phenograss project is really looking at perennial ryegrass pastures and how these pastures and the different varieties of perennial ryegrass in these pastures are going to respond to Ireland's future climates, and also specifically to waterlogging events that are going to occur in the future. And we've been looking at how the ryegrass responds in terms of its biomass production and also the timing of its growth. So both these quantities are important for agricultural production, but they also could be important for the amount of carbon that these grasslands could capture. And so Ireland is unique in its grasslands. It's the only country in Europe that has over half its land area covered by grassland. So it's an important land use and an important culture in Ireland. And Ireland's grasslands are relatively diverse. They go from the ryegrass pastures, which we've been looking at, through to kind of semi-natural grasslands with high biodiversity. So there's a broad range of grassland types in Ireland. And this important land use is going to be affected by climate change and has challenges to overcome. So some of these challenges actually seem like benefits. So the growing season is going to lengthen by up to maybe 20% is the predictions for the mid-century. So this is going to provide kind of a longer growing season and potential benefits, but there are other environmental changes that are going to be more challenging. So we're going to have greater extreme events. So wet days are going to become more common, predicted up to 50% more wet days in Ireland, and more extreme heat events as well. So there's going to be a greater range of variation in climate, and that is going to be challenging for agriculture, and there's going to have to be some adaptation to these different conditions. So these have been a product of human kind of induced climate change, and greenhouse gas emissions are a driver of this. And agriculture's emissions are an important part of that for Ireland. So the EPA's latest figures for the greenhouse gas emissions from Ireland puts agriculture's component at 37%, and that's up 1.4% from 2019. So the situation isn't the best, but because grasslands are such an important land use in Ireland, these land types present a potential big part of the solution as well. And the climate action plan that the government produced last year kind of gives some of these potential solutions that this important land use could be contributing towards. And grasslands are specifically mentioned in 2 of the actions from this action plan. So getting back to our project, so we're trying to provide some of the evidence to back up potential solutions that agriculture can be a part of in addressing climate change and Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions by providing evidence for how ryegrass responds to future climates, how different varieties, do they have any different effects in future climates, and how are they impacted by challenges such as waterlogging on the fields. And Carl is going to present some of the findings from the project a bit later on. So I hope you enjoy the webinar and enjoy the discussion, and I'll hand back to Anya to the next speaker. Thank you. You're muted, Anya.
I was unmuted. Unmute myself. There we go. I'm so sorry, Max. Thank you for that introduction, John. We're going to hear in more detail now about the Phenagrass project from the postdoctoral research fellow who's been working mainly on this, and that's Carl Frisk of the UCD Earth Institute. And he's going to talk to us about Phenagrass now. So, Carl.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk a bit about our project and what the results have mainly been so far. Yeah, so our project focus has been to investigate perennial ryegrass, and what we really wanted to know is that we wanted to see how climate change and waterlogging is influencing the growth and also the leaf appearance of the perennial ryegrass. And also we wanted to see if some varieties are more resilient to cope in these warmer and wetter climates. As you can see in these images here, these are from our experiments. The top one hasn't been waterlogged, and you see it looks quite sturdy and it has a lot of tillers and it's looking quite healthy. Then you see the bottom picture here where we have one of our waterlogged samples, and it looks rather sad a little bit, you could almost say. So we have these experimental growth chambers that we use to simulate these future conditions. You see a picture here of how they look inside with the setup and our cores that we've been using. So these growth chambers, they can regulate temperature, light intensity, photoperiod, humidity, and atmospheric gases. And that makes us be able to simulate the future climate conditions, where we have the estimated climate change scenario in 2050, which is increase of 2 degrees centigrade, and then 550 ppm of CO2. So we've been trying to simulate 5 months from May to September for a lot of these replicated varieties and for replicated cores and 4 varieties. And then during June, we had 1 month of waterlogging, and then we let the cores recover naturally to see how that affected their overall performance. So we measured both the growth rate in biomass, in height, the amount of tillers they produced, and also their leaf appearance, the phyllochron. And you can see on the graph here, with the x-axis being height growth rate based on multiple harvests, and then the y-axis being biomass growth rate. So what we see here is that all of our cores for the different harvests, how they respond to waterlogging or not being waterlogged in terms of overall growth rate. And we can see that the red dots here, they're the waterlogged cores, and the blue, or the red ones being the ones that are ambiently watered, and the blue ones being the ones that are watered. And we can see a 74% average reduction in biomass accumulation, which is quite a lot if you think about just 1 month of waterlogging and then recovery. You see that the speed of leaf appearance, or the phyllochron, was reduced with about 9% for the cores that were waterlogged. So a small reduction. We've also done some some color analysis work that isn't strictly related in the presentation, but we've seen that.
Carl,
yeah.
Carl, sorry to interrupt you. I think you're on presentation mode, so we can't see the full screen of your presentation.
Oh, am I? I'm sorry. I'll try it again.
It's just tricky to see the graphs in that mode.
I think you need to change the display settings at the top of the screen.
Okay, let's try this then. Did it help?
No. If you go into share screen
About that.
and you go into presentation mode.
Did that help?
It's still very small, at least on my screen.
Yeah, we see the PowerPoint version where you can also see the next slide as a small thumbnail.
Okay.
Is your screen maximized?
Yeah, I'll wait a little bit. Sorry for this, guys. Just a bit.
Okay, sorry to interrupt you.
Sorry.
Screen sharing. Yep, that's definitely better.
Does that look better?
Yeah,
that's
no,
much
yes,
better.
yeah,
Thank you
it.
so much,
Perfect.
Carl. Great.
Perfect. Sorry about that. So as I was saying, we also had some photographs taken and did a color analysis of our samples, and we saw that the cores that were waterlogged, the plants, had overall lighter leaf coloration, likely affecting overall plant pigmentation, photosynthesis, and the overall growth. So to recap a little bit, while we're lost in a technical confusion here, waterlogging reduces the plant growth in quite an extreme way, as you can see by the graph. We also looked at the overall effects of climate change on the growth. On the graph here, you can see in the green line how the July conditions were affected. So the dark lines here are the treatment for July and for August, while the light ones are the ambient conditions. And we can see that overall that climate change had a minimal effect and increased the biomass accumulation by about 12%, but it only had a very small increase on the phylochrone. So for August and July, during the months of peak growth, we can see that it was barely any effect. The lines, they look very similar, but it might extend the growth season on either sides of the peak season. So we can see in July and September that there's a bigger difference between the treatment and the ambient growth settings. So it's possible that climate change doesn't really impact the growth on the peak season, but it can extend it on either side of it. We've also seen minimal differences between diploid and tetraploid varieties. This graph, it's a modeled phylochrone for tetraploid and diploid varieties, and what we can see is that the p-values, they're very large in the phylochrone effect. So it doesn't matter if the variety is a diploid or tetraploid, they respond about equally to the climate change scenario, which is not very big at all. So we can see that it doesn't matter for climate change or the waterlogging if it's a diploid or a tetraploid variety, because they respond the same way in terms of leaf appearance and overall growth. On the other hand, some further modeling might reveal small but relevant differences between individual varieties that might have practical implications in the field, since we talk about huge proportions of ryegrass in the field, where even like a small few percent difference in growth can have a big practical effect overall. So what are our take-home messages? We've seen that waterlogging has a strong negative effect on both the health and the productivity of these perennial ryegrass plants. We suspect that the effect from the waterlogging is related to the root proliferation and the nutrient uptake. We see on the picture here to the right how the roots extend throughout the soil column, with the soil column that we've been using is about 0.5 meter. So it represents to a large extent how natural grasslands behave. We've seen that climate change seemed to be able to extend the ryegrass growth period, although the strength of this effect and how big it is and how practically implicatable it is will be quantified by our models. We've also seen that there's not that big a difference between the diploid and the tetraploid varieties, that they're about equally resistant to climate change and waterlogging, but that there might be individual effects from individual varieties. So it was a bit sped up there towards the end, but that was my highlighting of our findings so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Can I just ask one clarification? Can you explain to us, please, the difference between the tetraploid and the diploid varieties? These are varieties of ryegrass, right?
Yeah, so it's based on the genetics of their cell structures. So it depends on how many chromosomes and so they have, and this makes them express different proteins and so differently. So they can have some effects in terms of the growth and so on based on the number of their genetic quantities.
Okay. Thank you for that. If people do have questions who are listening in, please feed them in to the question function on YouTube, and we will be taking all of those questions together after these presentations, if there's specific questions about the presentations, and then we'll be having a wider discussion after that. So thank you very much for that, Carl. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who's going to give us a very quick 5-minute presentation. Dr. Sharon O'Rourke is an assistant professor in the UCD School of Biosystems and Food Engineering. Her research focuses on soil carbon and its importance in agronomy and climate change mitigation. And Sharon is going to talk to us a little bit also about carbon sequestration in soil this evening. So over to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Anya, and hello and good evening to everybody. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. We can see that okay?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you, Sharon.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to start with a little overview of what is soil carbon sequestration. So this is a very basic diagram showing that what we want to do really is convert the plant or the grass carbon into soil carbon. So it's a transfer of carbon from the net plant primary production. And in grass, we're really talking about carbon inputs from the below ground components. So the root turnover, the rhizome deposition, and a smaller pool is the soil microbial community itself, which is responsible for turning over the carbon. So they're the powerhouse. And then also there are external inputs, so manure or organic inputs to the soil that contain carbon. Okay, so how much soil carbon can we store? Well, in grassland, we know that we can sequester around 0.5 ton of carbon per hectare per year. So that's around the sequestration rate that's currently possible. And unfortunately in Ireland, we don't have long-term experiments that show carbon change over a long period of time, where we can then go and look at an annual sequestration rate. But there is some data available. And in Northern Ireland, in a study in AFBI, rates of carbon sequestration between 1.1 and 1.4 tons of carbon per hectare have been recorded. And that's under best management practices under a range of different nitrogen inputs. So if I just draw your attention to this plot over here on the left-hand side, this is a theoretical, different theoretical curve. So there is a finite amount of carbon that a soil can store. And this is, upper level or a saturated level, which is the top curve. But it's probably more realistic that farmers can achieve some sort of upper level of carbon stabilization in the soil. And the bottom curve here is a critical level, whereby if carbon drops below a threshold level, the soil is degraded and may be impaired. So on the x-axis, we get more carbon when we have more clay content in the soil. On the y-axis is the soil organic carbon percent. So what we're trying to do now in Ireland is to establish the soil carbon sequestration rates on an annual basis over a range of different paleoclimatic scenarios, so different soils, different climates, and over a range of different management scenarios, different nutrient management or nitrogen input and reseeding, multi-species forests has been a couple of examples. So in terms of the policy context, there's a real focus on this at the moment. Soil health and food is one of the missions in the EU Horizon Europe call, and we're delighted to see soils getting so much recognition there. And over the last couple of years, there's been discussions at EU level, so roundtable carbon farming discussions over the last 2 years. And as a direct output of that, there's been a technical guidance handbook that was published last year on setting up and implementing results-based carbon farming mechanisms in the EU. And of course, this is mentioned again in the Climate Action Plan at national level. So carbon farming is recognised as a measure that's coming down the track. Okay, so how are we going to go about measuring that soil carbon sequestration then to enter into carbon farming programs? Well, there's two ways that this can be done. And at national level, there's a number of national agricultural soil observatories being set up across different sites around the country. And this employs eddy covariance, which is a micrometeorological technique used to measure CO2. And this is looking at the gross CO2. So that's respired and by the soil system, and that's retained within the soil itself. So we want to establish what are the principal drivers of soil carbon sequestration in terms of climate and soil type and management. And the other way we're going to measure soil carbon stock, which is relying on more of physical soil measurements, is rounds of field sampling that are going to occur at intervals of approximately 4 years. So this is an example of an MRV, or measurement, monitoring and reporting and verification protocol for soil carbon that's been published by the FAO GSOC. And this will be conducted on a farm or field basis, whereas the other measurement is collecting CO2 and then verifying against those physical soil measurements. So just to touch on a little bit of my own work in soil carbon sequestration, I'm working on a project that's funded by the Irish Research Council that goes by the acronym Carbon Function. And within that project, and my team members, Naziz, Shehan and Sharan, we're looking at carbon nutrient stoichiometry to stabilize soil organic matter and improve soil function. And what we're trying to do here is to recognize that carbon really needs nutrient input as well as just fresh carbon input to become stabilized in the soil over time. And we're trying to make a quantitative link between additional carbon that's been sequestered and improved soil function. So looking at the link between carbon and a range of soil physical, chemical, and biological parameters. So within that project, just very quickly, we're looking at laboratory, glasshouse, and field phases to look at the fine fractions of organic matter stabilization. And then we're looking to try to maximize this in the presence of a growing crop. So how can we optimize both carbon stabilization and crop productivity? And then we're moving into the field to look at that under conservation and conventional agricultural systems, so till and no-till. And one other thing I'd like to mention here is another project is involving digital soil mapping. And this is using the Terra soil resources from the GSI TELUS survey with colleagues Karen Daly and Marie Glennon. And this also uses the Irish Soil Information System. And what we're trying to do here is map the soil carbon sequestration potential of Irish soil. So look at the soil carbon saturation potential and map that around the country to identify soils and areas around the country that have the greatest soil carbon sequestration potential. something that will feed into the national picture. Okay, so that's it from me. Thank you. Anya. Anya, you're mute there.
Unmute myself. Thank you so much, Sharon. That was really interesting. I have loads of questions. I'm sure there's questions coming in from participants already, but really interesting to hear about the policy context as well as the research. So thank you for that. The next short presentation we have is from Angela Feakin, who is a lecturer in crop science in the School of Agriculture and Food Science in UCD as well. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about pathogens and future climate.
Thanks. Is that okay? Is it Mac?
That's perfect.
Cool.
That we can see that. Great. Thank you so much, Angela. Yeah.
So I'll just give a quick overview on the relationship between crop protection and climate change. So this world map shows that by 2050, what's expected to happen is that in the areas that are shaded red, so the number of crop pest species is expected to increase, and the ones that are in blue are expected to decrease. So you can see that, for example, in Ireland, it's mainly red, and so we'd be expecting that what we'll see is an increase in the different pest species, so the different pathogens that can cause disease, so fungi, bacteria, and also kind of insect pests. And so there was work done in Exeter that also showed that what's happening is that year on year, pathogens that cause disease in crops are moving towards the poles. So, for example, if you have, if we take Ireland as an example, we might see pathogens coming into Ireland from warmer countries, and that wouldn't normally be able to be established in the climate here, but because it gets a little bit warmer, they're able to move into those areas. So as climate change progresses, what we might see is different kinds of pathogens coming in and being able to get established, whereas they wouldn't have in the past. So that's how climate change is impacting on the pests and the diseases that we see in terms of plants or crop production. But actually, crop protection itself and also adding fertilizer application itself is adding to climate change. So as we use fossil-based pesticides and fossil-based fertilizers, making those produces greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, and also adding them to the soil then can make greenhouse gases such as nitrous oxide. So even crop production itself is adding to greenhouse gas emissions. So is there a way to protect crops and also address this issue of kind of inputs to greenhouse gas emissions? So one of the things that so this is obviously the EU Green Deal, the EU Farm to Fork, which is part of the EU Green Deal, which is looking to reduce pesticide inputs and also reduce fertilizer inputs. So is there something that we can do to address climate change and reduce these inputs, basically? So one of the things is that the EU is kind of promoting the use of these bio-based products. So a few years ago, we got involved in a project to look at a biostimulant, okay? And so there's a few different bio terms that people use. And so you'll hear people talking about biofertilizers, biostimulants, biopesticides. So I'll use two of these terms as I go along, and maybe we can talk about what the differences are later. But so we started to use a biostimulant product, which was a microbial fermentation product. So that means it has microbes in it and also has things like yeast in it. And we were able to show that we could decrease fungal infections using this product. Okay, so you can see that there's less fungal infections on the the microbial fermentation product. And we were also able to show in a later study that we could protect against a different fungus. This is Fusarium head blight in wheat. And also, interestingly, the biostimulant also seemed to improve grain weight as well. And we're not really sure why, but so it seemed to, as well as helping plant health, also seemed to help yield as well. So this really led to kind of putting together a big kind of national project. So you can see the different organizations and different people involved here, and also some companies as well, to try and look at more in depth at these bio-based products. So I won't go into all of the things that are happening, but as well as looking at the two examples that I'll show you, they're also looking at to see if the bio-based products are actually, what is the life cycle? Are they really more environmentally friendly? Are they going to be more in terms of economics? So are they, are they going to be affordable compared to what we use as conventional fertilizers or pesticides? So this is just a couple of the examples. So this came off the back of a previous project that was done between UCD and Trinity, and they actually formed a spin-out company using these, what we call endophytes. So you can think about them a little bit like friendly gut bacteria. Okay, so if you friendly gut bacteria, it helps your kind of overall your health. And so it's the same kind of idea for plants as well. So there's these microbes that live inside them that probably help them fight off disease and also help them kind of cope with stress. And this, so this was done between Trinity and UCD, and they went off and they found these microbes that live inside kind of crop wild relatives. And they found, and there's a couple of the papers down here listed, and they found that these friendly microbes were able to help the crop cope with stress and improve yields. And as I said, that kind of led to a spin-out company. So as part of this project that I'm talking about, BioCrop, we're also finding more of these kind of endophytes, and specifically endophytes that might be able to help barley and diseases that infect barley, so things like ramularia. And we're also looking to see what compounds these endophytes make. So we know that some of them seem to produce a compound that inhibits the growth of, for example, this is ramularia. So on the top, you can see the ramularia in barley, and on the right-hand side, the kind of purpley growth is ramularia on a plate. And then you can see on the other side that there's not very much growth, and that's because there's a compound there that's acting as a biopesticide. So it's actually stopping the ramularia from growing. So can we use that a bit more like a conventional pesticide to protect against pathogens? So that's all very well, but do these things work in the field? So the endophytes are currently getting tested down at Oak Park at Chagask to see if the endophytes can protect against, again, ramularia and barley and things like barley yellow dwarf virus. And this is lions. Okay, so this is a trial that Mary Luth and Saoirse put out at lions, and this is testing commercial biostimulants to see if, again, they can, how they perform in terms of traditional fertilizer inputs, and also how they perform in terms of plant health. So, are we going to see more or less disease on these plots? So yeah, that's it. Watch this space, and thanks very much.
Super. Thank you so much, Angela. That is really interesting. I like the comparison with our gut bacteria and giving the plants that bit more resilience. Interesting work. So our final speaker for this section is Liam Brennan from Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, who's going to talk to us. He's an inspector with the department, and he's going to talk to us about the Climate Action Plan, specifically in how it relates to grass-based carbon sequestration. So over to Liam for 5 minutes, and if any of our attendees do have questions, please do funnel those in through the chat function on YouTube. Thanks, Liam.
Good evening, all. Just waiting for the presentation there. Thanks, Rainer. Yeah, so briefly in this presentation, I'm just going to take you through, I suppose, policy from an international EU level, and then down to the new climate legislation that we have in Ireland, and then go through some points specific to agriculture within the Climate Action Plan 2021. So next slide, please. So I suppose at the top level in international policy point of view, it I suppose begins with the Paris Agreement of 2015, which focused on the limiting temperature rise to less than 2 degrees above pre-industrialization levels, and to pursue a limit of less than 1.5 degrees. So from an EU point of view, the increase in ambition that's there now at EU level is set out in the Fit for 55 package of proposals, which were released in July of 2021. And the objective of those legislative package is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% across the EU by 2030. And I suppose surrounding that package of legislation, the European Green Deal for the whole of the European economy released in 2019, and specifically to agriculture, and mentioned previously by Angela, the farm to fork strategies and the biodiversity strategies. Next slide, please. So then from a national policy direction, we have the objective of meeting that step up that's identified at our European level. We then have the programme for government, which identifies the target will be to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland by 51% by 2030. And then we have the recent updated legislation is the 2021 Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Amendment Act, which has the objective of that 51% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030, and also climate neutral economy in Ireland by 2050. So the Climate Action Plan has been set out, 2021 has been set out to identify the steps necessary to achieve that increased ambition in Ireland. Next slide, please. So the new legislation, the Act, it is the national strategic objective, as I mentioned, to identify how we're going to get to a carbon neutral economy by 2050. Reducing greenhouse gases by 51% by 2030 is legally binding under that legislation, which I suppose is the biggest step. It also sets out the pathways to how we're going to achieve those targets. In particular, it identifies that there is going to be a requirement for annual climate action plans, and the requirement for 5-year yearly strategies to be set out. There's also a requirement for carbon budgets, 5 yearly carbon budgets to be set down, and from those, which I'll mention a bit in a minute, there will be a setting of sectoral ceilings for each individual sector within the Irish economy. The carbon budgets have been identified that it must be consistent with the Paris Agreement and all other international obligations. And then those sectoral ceilings will be set out post the agreement of the carbon budgets. Then actions for each sector will be set out in those annual climate action plans, with government ministers being responsible for the legally binding targets within their own sector. Next slide, please. So here, this slide just gives some detail of the carbon budgets and the carbon budget and sectoral ceiling processes. So if we look at the top table, we have the carbon budgets, as I mentioned, are divided into the 5-year period. So the first one is from 21 to 25, and the carbon budgets as proposed for that period is a total for the economy of 295 megatons of CO2 equivalents. That's to reduce down in the second budgetary period to 200, and then down to 151 in the 2031 to 2035 period. So, and the second line, I suppose, there within that table identifies that in that first budgetary period, the 295 sets out a reduction on an annual basis of greenhouse gases by 4.8%, and then an annual reduction in that overall budget by 8.3% on an annual basis for the second budgetary period. And just the piece underneath then, it just identifies the road to the sectoral ceilings, if you like. So we have the Climate Change Advisory Council proposed the carbon budgets on the 25th of October of 2021. They were then passed to the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Environment and Climate Action, and they approved them on the 7th of February of this year. And then they've now been sent for government approval, with the target of approval by the end of February, which we're pretty much at the minute. So once that process is finished, and once the government approves or amends and approves the carbon budgets, then we move on to setting of the sectoral ceilings. Next slide, please. So then just identify in this slide here, right in the middle in red, identifies the targets within the Climate Action Plan 2021 for the agricultural sector. So the base year is the 2018 emissions, and for agriculture, the base was 23 metric tons in CO2 equivalents of greenhouse gases in 2018. And the target for 2030 with agriculture is to reduce those emissions to within the range of 16 to 18 megatons, which is a percentage reduction from 2018 of 22 to 30%. Next slide, please. So I won't go into all the detail here, but just to give a flavour, this is identified within the Climate Action Plan within the agricultural chapter. So here we just have some of the measures that have been identified on how agriculture is going to achieve that reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The first one, which is the largest, is a focus on chemical nitrogen reductions and the actual amount of chemical nitrogen that's used on Irish farms. And then the increased ambition for use of protected urea to replace the likes of calcium ammonium nitrate fertilizers, which have higher nitrous oxide emissions. We also have a measure here for a focus on improved animal breeding, improved animal feeding, an earlier finishing age of cattle to make a contribution towards the reduction. There's also a focus on a target here set out for organic farming. So the target is to increase the amount of hectares organically farmed in Ireland from 74,000 hectares currently to 350,000 hectares by 2030. There's also a measure in relation to a contribution from agriculture into biomethane or bioenergy. And then we also have identified, in addition to measures, we've identified further measures which have to be further developed. And that's where carbon farming comes in, and also further research into methane additives on the animal feeding side, and then further work in relation to diversification options for farmers. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide, I suppose. Within the agricultural sector, there is the land use and land use change and forestry sector. And currently in Ireland, the land use sector itself is an emitter of emissions. The emissions coming from our peat soils in particular and organic soils exceeds what is being taken in by our grassland soils. And then we have a contribution from forestry, which is very much dependent on forestry planting levels, which has gone down in recent years. But the target for this LULUCF sector, or the land use change and forestry sector, is to reduce emissions by 4.6 metric tons of CO2 equivalents by 2030. And to do this, we've identified a number of measures, which includes forestation rates to be increased, 80,000 hectares of reduced management of those organic soils or peat soils that are currently farmed, improved management of carbon sequestration on 450,000 hectares of grasslands. And then also there's measures in relation to tillage ground, in relation to cover crops and tillage and straw incorporation. The last two bullet points I have here, the second last one is in relation to rehabilitating peatlands, which is work that will be carried out by the National Parks and Wildlife, and typically on maybe Bornemona lands. And the very last one is in relation to the marine. So I'll finish there and leave it, and we can maybe deal with some more in detail with questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Liam. Again, good to see the policy context, though not so specific to grasslands. And I'm sure there'll be questions about that, and there'll be time for that. In fact, are there questions through from the audience at this point that specifically relate to any of those presentations in advance of our wider panel discussion? Are there clarifications in relation to the presentations? I don't see anything coming into me here. There's no direct questions to any of the presenters. So what we're going to do now, after all of those presentations, and we can see that there's a really wide variety of different issues being dealt with here, everything from how ryegrass is responding to water logging, up to the wider soil carbon sequestration and the rates. Sharon, I was slightly confused by the differential between a half a ton per hectare and the 1.1 to 1.4 tons per hectare. We might get a chance to clarify that. Or actually, maybe is that appropriate to shoot that to you now? Do we know for the different types of grass-based agriculture in Ireland what the rates of sequestration are per hectare? How much information? I know you spoke about that, but the difference there confuses me between half a ton and 1.4 tons.
Yeah, sure. So I think the point I was trying to make there is that we know that we can achieve a sequestration rate on an annual basis of approximately half a ton. So then, in order to optimize the rates of soil carbon sequestration, and we want to try to maybe push the system a little bit further, because what's being recognized in the result-based carbon farming is additionality. So it's additional carbon over a measured baseline. So
I get you.
There's other 1.1 to 1.4 tons are the upper end of the possible carbon sequestration rates.
Okay, super. Thank you. That's really good as well to clarify that the results-based systems offer payments as reward for additionality. That's really important point for me anyway. Thank you. And the pests and diseases issues from Angela as well, and the bio-based products, really interesting. Sounds like quite new, possibly very old, but in technological terms, quite new ways of approaching plant health. What we have now is a panel discussion where we have all of the speakers. That's Sharon, Angela, Liam, as well as Gary Thompson. Gary, thank you for joining us, Gary, who is a dairy farmer in North Antrim, and he's also Nuffield Farming Fellow. Welcome, Gary. And we have Helen Sheridan as well. And Helen, many of us know, she's Associate Professor in the School of Agriculture and Food Science in UCD, and she's done a lot of work on the role of multi-species grasslands in ecosystems delivery, carbon, biodiversity, the implementation of agri-environment schemes and measures, and also looking at habitats in agricultural landscapes. So welcome and thank you for joining us also, Helen. And we also have Rainer Metzler, Rainer, who is also from the Phenogas Grass Project, who's going to join us for the panel discussion as well, so we can address the questions. The first question that I want to put to the panel is that there is a perception out there that climate change will not necessarily be a bad thing, in that we will have a prolonged growing season. And we have seen from what Carl presented to us that is the case, that there will be a longer growing season, perhaps. Do we know how much that will, I guess, tally with the impacts of drought or water logging or those other issues? So on the one hand, we've got a longer growing season, and on the other hand, we've got reduced grass growth based on water logging and other issues. How has there been any work done to kind of tally that? Maybe Rainer or Angela could talk to us about that.
Yeah, so I'd say it depends on the specific conditions, whether the increased temperatures and the longer growing seasons associated to that can compensate for extreme weather events. But on average, I would probably say an extreme weather event like a drought or prolonged water logging at least what we see, they have so significant impacts on the crop that it can't really be balanced by slightly higher temperatures. So we see, at least for ryegrass in our experiments, that the plants grow better under higher temperatures, but they don't grow a lot better. They grow a little better, but then the waterlogging has massive negative consequences on the biomass accumulation. So the effect depends, of course, also on the crop, but ryegrass in particular is relatively tolerant to waterlogging. So we waterlogged our plants for 4 weeks. Other crops like barley or wheat, they are much less tolerant to waterlogging. So on average, I would say the increase in extreme weather events will have a detrimental effect on crop productivity in most cases, and that cannot, in many cases, be balanced out by slightly higher temperatures and longer growth seasons.
That's really interesting, and thank you. That's really clear. I think that's important to be clear on that the longer growth season is more than counterbalanced, or that the marginally improved growth is more than counterbalanced by the waterlogging anyway, and the drought. You mentioned barley and some other crops. Have you done any of that work for mixed grassland species swards?
So I know we personally haven't looked into this. I know there are other research projects at UCD going on looking into waterlogging in barley, for example, that are led by Sonja Negrau, who's a colleague of mine in the School of Biology, but those projects are beginning to be started. And yeah, I don't know what the results of this is. So for multi-species swards, probably Helen would be better positioned to answer this, I think.
Helen, do you have anything to contribute there?
I guess if we think back as an example to the summer of 2020, when we had prolonged hot, dry conditions, that drought of 2020, certainly the observations were that ryegrass didn't do particularly well under those conditions, and there was serious concern about loss of, farmers were reopening silage bales to feed animals. In response to that, I can't remember, it was about 6 weeks where we didn't have rain for that period. From preliminary results looking at our own multi-species work, we see that we did see a dip in yield, but not such a big dip. But interestingly, they seem to come out of that dip faster. And that's also been found by others working in this space as well. So they can't completely get us over, the multi-species can't necessarily completely get us over the drought conditions, but they do seem to give enhanced or increased resilience under those conditions.
Thank you. So could we say broadly that the multi-species swards would have a tendency to be more resilient to the impact of climate change, like waterlogging and drought?
Well, we would expect that, given the different plant species, when you enhance the diversity of the sward, that you're bringing in plants from different functional groups and with different growth and rooting strategies, that by doing that you will enhance the resilience of the sward overall. But there is quite a lot unknown about it yet. Okay,
thank you very much, Helen.
No problem.
We have a question here from the audience from Patrick Donlan, who says, hi, great presentations. And it's Carl, he is specifically asking about the definition of waterlogging. Carl, I think you said a number of weeks. How long were the plants waterlogged for, and how long after germination were the plants waterlogged? It's a very specific question there. So, thank you very much, Patrick.
Thank you, Patrick. So we started with the germination procedures in beginning of the simulated month of May, and then about a month into the germination or the growing of the plants, we waterlog them. So it will be in the beginning of the simulated month of June. So about 35 days after the germination had started, we did the waterlogging, and by that point, all of the plants had germinated seedlings. And then the waterlogging, we wanted to simulate these extreme weather events that we're likely to see in climate change scenarios leading to long-term flooding. So we wanted to look at the long-term waterlogging and see effects from that. So we had waterlogging for about 30 days, about 4 weeks, 30 days. And then we slowly reduced the waterlogging and let the water subside naturally to simulate how it would be in natural conditions. So that was the waterlogging experimental setup.
Super, thank you very much for that, Carl. We have a question in about are pure ryegrass pastures the way forward in Irish agriculture? Now, I know that we are still seeing the conversion a lot of semi-natural grasslands into ryegrass pastures, and this is, I think there is a commonly held perception that this is the way forward in terms of its productivity. So we have a question here: are pure ryegrass pastures the way forward in Irish agriculture? I would like to ask a few of you for responses, but Helen, I'm going to go first to you again, please.
Okay, ryegrass is a fantastic plant. I'm going to start off by that. You know, it's got this ability to recover following defoliation, so it recovers rapidly. It produces very high quantities of good quality forage, but it needs to be fed. It needs high levels of nitrogen fertilizer to do that, or to be fed other forms of nitrogen, whether it's through the provision of N from legumes, for example. So I think certainly legume inclusion in swards is an absolute must, given our commitments under the farm to fork strategy. So at a minimum, we need to be increasing our inclusion of legumes, so our white clovers, for example, in our swards. And beyond that, I think there is certainly much scope for enhancing the diversity even further to enhance resilience to extremes in weather conditions, but also potential resilience to diseases and pests also. We're seeing the work that we've been doing at UCD Lyons Farm. We're seeing that our multi-species swards are producing more dry matter with 60% less nitrogen fertilizer than our perennial ryegrass monocultures. We're seeing that the animals are performing better and are going to slaughter earlier. So that means that we're reducing the potential for nitrous oxide emissions from the nitrogen fertilizer, but we're also reducing the potential for methane production from the livestock because they're being slaughtered up to 6-7 weeks earlier, as it was the case this year. So I think there will be a place for ryegrass, but I do think we need to be looking at more diverse swards as a means of maintaining or enhancing productivity under increasingly challenging conditions, but also reducing that need for fossil-based inputs into our systems.
Okay, so I would take from what you're saying that in the context of climate change, ryegrass, pure ryegrass pastures are not really the way forward if we're to be meeting those commitments that we saw under the Climate Action Plan.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Helen. Would anybody else like to contribute on that particular question, ryegrass pastures as the way forward for Irish agriculture or not?
I could comment on that.
Yes, great.
So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to join on the panel discussion this evening. So as a dairy farmer, when we get warmer and wetter climates, utilisation becomes a problem. And I have a few multi-species swards sown, and I have to say the animals really do enjoy eating them. There's no issues with animals eating the crop. There is a few issues with multi-species swards as regards silage crops, where we do need a bit more research done in that area as regards conserving, because the multi-species tend to be quite a wet or have a low dry matter. So they're harder to dry once you're trying to ensile them as a forage. And then also a number of the species can be quite high in protein. So we need that, means they're hard to conserve. So therefore there's a bit of a, from a farmer point of view, there's a bit of a lack of knowledge from how to conserve high multi-species swords. And in a wetter climate, it's going to be more difficult. And if you have a wet multi-species sward ensiled, it will turn to, it will have a high nitrogen content, and the protein will turn to back to nitrogen. And essentially, the nitrogen will appear in it without going through the cow, and you end up with a very unpalatable conserved forage. And as regards nitrogen application, there are a number of farmers who are applying fuller nitrogen applications along with some carbon and molasses, as it happens, to feed the plants a nitrogen application through a foliar spray. And again, that's an area where, as farmers, we lack knowledge, and some research in that area, some firm knowledge to know how to do that would be very much welcomed.
That's really interesting. Thank you for that contribution, Gary. That's one area then that we can put back to note from the research team, is how to conserve. I noticed you used the word conserve in a very different way to what I used to conserve, but how to conserve or preserve the multi-species, that it's palatable to the cattle, that it doesn't break back down from protein into nitrogen, right? Some research there of how that could be done. Is there anybody else would like to contribute to this particular subject? I don't see any hands up from our panelists at the moment.
I think Helen's got her hands up, actually.
Helen, please.
You know, exactly what Gary says there. There are issues certainly with conserving multi-species swords for silage, particularly where there's a high herb content in them, which there will be in the initial years because the dry matter content of those is quite low. So we have undertaken some research together with Chagas Grange, looking at those, and you know, the overall finding was that if you have poor weather conditions, you're going to end up with a worse silage from a multi-species sward than you would from a poor ryegrass sward. So certainly enhanced wilting of the sward is going to be very necessary. And that's why I say, I mean, not everywhere is going to be suitable for multi-species swords, whether it's ryegrass and white clover combinations. I think we'll probably need that in order to meet our commitments under decreased fertilizer inputs, or, you know, in some cases there might be space for ryegrass monocultures, but I think we need to be broadening the I suppose where we look at and what direction we're going, that we're not just looking at monocultures as we move forward from here. But there are certainly some challenges with them, and yes, we need more research. We've had essentially 60 years of research on ryegrass, and we've only had a handful of projects on multi-species swords in this part of the world to date.
Super, that's interesting. Thank you, Helen. Does anybody else want to come in on that before I'm going to shift the conversation over slightly to carbon and carbon sequestration in grasslands? There's a question about, are there specific practices that in the context of grassland can increase or reduce soil carbon sequestration? Sharon, is this something that you would like to, I know you've, oops, my timer going here. This is something that you've certainly touched on in your presentation, but can you give us some sense of what can be done to increase the amount of soil carbon that's taken in?
Yeah, sure. I think a couple of things that are being put forward are to optimize the pH so that fertility is more optimized overall. Minimizing disturbance in reseeding of pastures, and paying a bit more attention to the carbon-nitrogen ratio. So when you have high carbon input and low nitrogen, the soil microbial community has a food source for so long, and then may turn around and start to mine existing soil carbon in the soil. So you're going to working in the other direction. So we need to keep focused on that as well.
Okay, thank you for that. And I know that when I was talking about this with an ecologist colleague the other day about this seminar, they were talking about semi-natural grasslands, and that I think the suggestion is that there's a much higher carbon sequestration in semi-natural grasslands than there would be in either ryegrass or multi-species swards. Sharon, can you tell us a bit about that, please?
Well, I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case in Ireland. You know, we're focusing on the carbon inputs and also decoupling. So in a natural system, you have a more coupled carbon and nitrogen cycle, so maybe less flux within the system. And in the more managed system, we're a bit more decoupled. So we're trying to bring that ratio, you know, back so that we have it more matched.
The carbon and nitrogen ratio being the core point here.
Yes.
Okay. And do you know, has there been any research done to compare the carbon sequestration of semi-natural grasslands?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any research in the Irish context on that. I'm wondering, you know, something that I'm particularly interested in is when maybe there's a switch over from a perennial ryegrass into you know, mixed species sward, for example, then how that affects the carbon sequestration, particularly in the early years of the sward establishment. So I think that's something that's going to come out in terms of the carbon monitoring, in terms of the projects at you know, the Signpost Chagas program, and the monitoring of multi-species swards around the country.
Okay, thank you for that. We have another question. Again, I think, Sharon, you might be the most appropriate person to put this into. What's the typical lifetime of carbon in soil under a grassland, and what factors affect this lifetime?
I think it's important to remember that carbon is cycling. So, you know, it's not it's not all there for a long period of time. So in the carbon monitoring schemes, we talk about permanence, which is something that's defined as being a 100-year period. But carbon is cycling at different rates in different pools. So we have fresh carbon that enters the soil, and we can think about in 3 pools. So one is like a labile or fast turnover pool of about 1 year. And then there's an intermediate pool of between years to decades, and then beyond that. And we're into the long-term carbon, which is more than 100 years. So what we really want to do is maximize on stabilized soil carbon. So the carbon that's stable as a result of different mechanizations in the soil. So absorbed onto clay particles or protected within soil structures. And there's a lot of focus on this at the moment in research. There's a lot of funding coming through to understand more the mechanization behind soil carbon stabilization.
Okay. Thank you for that. So there isn't a straightforward answer to that typical lifetime of carbon. If it's not that there is a typical lifetime, it's constantly cycling through.
No, not really. And when you have established a management system and a carbon stock, you really need to maintain that management system so that you've got that carbon and nutrient input into the soil. So if you change your management in some way, whereby you might start to lose carbon that has been sequestered over the previous period of time.
And when you say management system, can you give us an example of what that might mean?
So, well,
ploughing or fertilizer use, or what is a management system that would influence that?
Well, you might be doing something like, optimizing your manure management, measuring the nutrient content of manures, and more closely tailoring nutrient management for your particular farm.
Okay. Would anybody else like to, any of the panelists like to come in on this issue of the carbon storage under grassland? Okay, we will move on. Thank you very much for that, Sharon. We have another question, which is more in relation to the role of feed additives. I know that is something that Liam, you mentioned feed additives in relation to methane. There's a question here: what's the role of feed additives in mitigating greenhouse gases from Irish agriculture?
Happy to comment on that, and it's mentioned in a number of places in the Climate Action Plan. Of course, methane is our biggest greenhouse gas. It would be approximately 16 megatons of that total of 23 megatons of 2018 base. And feed additives, I suppose, are a new technology and something that's only developing, but certainly we're putting some weighting on it into delivering mitigation of methane in the agricultural sector in Ireland. So the European Food Safety Authority recently approved the first product, which is called 3-nop-3-nitrooxypropanol, which is a feed additive, and the product, the claim is that it can, in dairy cows, can reduce methane emissions from enteric fermentation by approximately up to 30%, which is really significant. So there may be more products coming on stream, and there's research into areas like seaweed taking place as well. But the product, I suppose, as it's called, the issue with it from an Irish point of view will be that as it currently stands, you have to kind of feed it on somewhat of a continuous basis, or at least a number of times per day to the animal. And in Ireland, because most of our animals are grazed outdoors for most of the year, we'd really only be able to maybe feed that type of an additive during the housing period. So the real challenge will be the development of something that will be suitable for pasture-based grazing animals, and that there's ongoing research into that. But at least I suppose there's a product now, looks like it's going to be approved by the European Commission later this year, and that is the start of it. But there's collaboration with New Zealand and ourselves in relation to trying to develop this pasture-based solution that would be applicable, maybe some type of a bolus for animals that could deliver that type of methane reduction for grazing animals.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else want to come in on that? Respond to that. I know myself that there was a lot of excitement over seaweed and seaweed additives being able to reduce the methane emissions, and then looking into that further myself with a team for EcoEye, and finding that from what we could see, that it's only relevant really in feedlot systems, so that it's not going to be the golden answer that we're looking for in relation to Irish agriculture, which is mostly not in feedlot systems. But yeah, there may be more to come from what you're saying. There may be other solutions in development. There's another question, Liam, I think specifically for you, with respect to the Climate Action Plan. What are the potential benefits and challenges for farmers? Now, this is very broad. Would you like to go for that, Liam? potential benefits and challenges?
I'll attempt it anyway. It's certainly, I suppose, if we looked at challenges and I suppose their benefit together, and there's a lot of different measures across the land use change and also the agriculture mitigation piece. But I suppose the big challenge will be the fact that there will be need for real transformative change within the agricultural sector to meet these targets. And the change itself means changing practices, adopting new technologies. So change is always a challenge in itself. But if we look at some of the new technology example on the mitigation side, in particular, reducing chemical nitrogen, if we can adopt, and it may not be suitable for all farming types, but if we can adopt the technologies such as increasing the amount of clover in grassland swards, use of multi-species swards, which we've just discussed, then there is real potential for farmers to reduce the amount of chemical nitrogen they're putting in and potentially achieve the same results, the same outputs, and maybe even with multi-species swards, the area research points to some increases in production and efficiency levels. So, and as we all know, with the price of fertilizers at the moment have jumped over 100% in many cases since last year. So there's a real cost saving for farmers, and particularly now with the big increases in chemical nitrogen, which with the recent developments in the world is unlikely to go down. A lot of our fertilizer in Ireland comes from Russia. So there's real potential there for cost savings, and as the price of fertilizer gets more expensive, then the potential for the farmer to reduce his costs really increases. Teagasc had a figure there recently that the average, I suppose, 1,000 gallons of slurry is now worth of animal slurry is now worth about €54, which is a big increase. So as fertilizer goes up, organic manures are worth much more, and it will bring maybe a more focus on that. So there's potential there. There's protected urea I mentioned in the presentation there, as well as a new technology which is available. Teagasc recently highlighted the fact that the use of the urea is 20% cheaper per unit of chemical nitrogen than calcium ammonium nitrate, which is used quite extensively on Irish farms. If we look there, Helen mentioned about earlier finishing of animals on multi-species swards, where we can achieve the likes of earlier finishing of animals, and there's a measure within the climate action plan on that. We can again, there's the targets and they're changes and difficult to achieve, but by adopting breeding, improved feeding, improved grassland management, we can potentially achieve those targets. And again, there's an efficiency gain to the farmer, and also potentially, if you look at ABP, their meat processor recently have launched a sustainability program which does identify bonus payments to farmers who can achieve these sustainability targets, and earlier finishing of animals is included in that target. So there's a lot in the mix, and we could discuss all the different measures up and down for agriculture, but I suppose there's a few examples. You're on mute there.
That's really good to have some tangible examples of how that might pan out. Thank you very much, Liam. We have 9 minutes left, and we have a few more good questions. There is one which is to outline, I think, Sharon, you did outline this, but somebody else, what exactly is results-based carbon farming? Is it Sharon who might, clarify that for us?
Yeah, sure. It's a scheme that requires a direct and explicit link between between the results delivered by greenhouse gas avoidance or carbon dioxide removal, and then the payments to the farmer or the landowner. So it's making the linkage between the result and the payments, really.
Thank you. It's really interesting to hear about that, because we've all heard lots about the Burren scheme where they've introduced results-based agri-environment schemes, and that's for delivery of biodiversity benefit, and there's a payment associated with a small payment if there's a small amount of benefit, and a bigger payment if there's a big amount of benefit. So it's follows on from that. It seems like quite a logical way to do it. I imagine that the monitoring of that, which we've also discussed, could be quite challenging, but there's one more, there's a question here, are there other potential benefits to carbon sequestration aside from carbon, like soil biodiversity, nutrient cycling, or erosion stability? So I guess if we do those measures that enhance the amount of carbon sequestered by the soil, are there co-benefits to biodiversity or to water from those measures? Do we know that yet?
I think we have a good idea that soil carbon is linked to better soil quality. So that's a universal indicator of soil quality, but sometimes we're lacking that overall quantitative relationship to make the link between soil carbon and specific soil functions. So there's a lot of focus on this at the moment in terms of how to quantify soil functions and how to tease out the importance of soil carbon in the soil function. So by soil functions, I mean the ability of soil to regulate flooding, or the ability of soil to provide fertility, and carbon is an integral part of that. In the flooding, carbon builds soil structure. It helps to bind aggregates together and produce macro aggregation in soils, and that's when you start to get more pathways for drainage in the soil. So there's just a couple of examples.
Okay, thank you. I'm very conscious that Gary, you've joined us here, and I think you're the only farmer in the group. I would like you to tell us a little bit more about what your response is to proposals like results-based carbon farming.
Well, it's quite interesting. The future, I feel quite excited about the future, the fact that we could provide ecosystem services as farmers and get paid for that, as well as production agriculture and producing food. I would, however, add a note of caution, and the carbon market is in a fledgling stage, and it is available to farmers currently. However, carbon is a two-way street, and I would be concerned that farmers could receive payments for storing carbon. However, due to an unforeseen drought or a flood event outside the farmer's control, or multiple wet seasons or multiple dry seasons, that carbon could then be released back into the air. So if the farmer was paid to accumulate on an ongoing basis, paid to store that carbon, but he or she then be responsible for if the carbon was released back into the atmosphere. So I am all for it. I think it's a very positive move, but I also add that note of caution to it. And any farmer should be very cautious signing up at this early stage, I feel. I have heard of schemes whereby farmers would be paid for carbon over a 5-year period. However, they were tied in for about 7 or 8 years. There was a 2-year lead-in for a control period to establish a baseline. They were paid for 5 years, and then they had to maintain the carbon they had already gained for another 3 years to be able to retain all their payments. So it's not a simple market, and it's not straightforward. There are more simple things whereby it could work in favour of grazing livestock alongside things like agroforestry or silvopasture, whereby you could accumulate carbon and get paid for carbon within the trees, and also graze livestock in among the grassland and among the trees as well. So yeah.
Super. Yeah, that's really interesting that the the idea that it could actually be negative over a long term, and are you then going to be penalized? I don't know if that's something that Sharon or Liam would like to address. Have you thought about that carbon could go up as well as down in the soil?
Maybe I'll come in first and then pass over to Liam. So we're waiting on Europe, we're in the design and development stages for a program. So we don't quite know what that's going to look like, but just to differentiate, there could be schemes for carbon sequestration, so that's positive carbon accrual over time, or there could be measures to maintain existing carbon. So it's the maintaining or the maintenance of existing carbon, I think, that you're referring to, Gary, where potentially if there's a loss, then there's no payment, or maybe even something else. And then in terms of the 7-year versus the 5-year payments, I think that might relate to the pre-implementation stages, where, like any project planning stage, there's a bit of prep work that needs to be done first. So that's kind of that could be kind of a lengthy lead in to the actual active program of measurement and monitoring.
What is probably referring to at the point of view is coming from was private. So private companies offering carbon from, say, an airline or an industry, steel industry or something, that didn't have options to sequester carbon itself, and therefore was purchasing that carbon from a third party, i.e. the farmers.
Mm-hmm. There is a good debate going on about whether we should try to withhold the credits and keep them within the agricultural sector, or if they should be available to non-ETS sector. So that's kind of an ongoing discussion. I wonder, would Liam have anything to comment on in that regard?
Just to comment that the European Commission are to bring forward legislation in relation to certification for carbon by the end of this year, a proposal on it, which will I think will provide quite an amount of direction for all of us. I'm involved at the moment looking at the Fit for 55 package, and in particular there's a regulation there which deals with the land use change and forestry. The current legislation being amended, but within that legislation there's what's called allowances for natural disturbances, I think, which would deal with the likes of, for forestry, fires or drought or wind, which would knock over trees. But it would seem to make a lot of sense that that type of something was outside the farmer's control due to nature, that there would be some sort of a mechanism for allowing for that in it, similar to what's currently proposed in the land use and land use change and forestry regulation at EU level.
We do have we have one more question, but we're actually out of time. We have a question for Angela about biopesticides and whether they could completely replace conventional pesticides in the future. But I'm going to not let you answer that, Angela. Sorry, because we did say we'd wrap up at 8:30. Do you want to give me a really quick a 10-second answer? Sorry, Angela.
Honest answer, I don't know.
Good.
Possibly.
Good to have an honest answer. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to John to close, but I would just like to thank all the speakers and all the panelists. This has been a really interesting discussion. There's so many different things have arisen this evening. I certainly have a lot of questions myself that I didn't have at the beginning, so I hope it's the same for everybody else. That's what coming together and having these events and these discussions is about, is learning from each other and finding out where the gaps in our knowledge are, and in the hopes that we will address those. We certainly have a long way to go and a lot to do. As Liam told us, 22 to 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture from 2018 That's an awful lot to achieve, and at the moment it seems like we're really not very clear on exactly how we're going to do that. So there is a lot more work to do. So this, I think, has been quite useful. I hope it will be useful for the researchers involved. So yeah, thank you to all the attendees as well. Thank you for your questions in from the audience. And I'm going to hand over to John now for a final closing comment.
Okay, thank you, Anya. Thank you for chairing all the discussions and for all the contributors, giving their varied views. And so I think you can see that there's going to be challenges for agriculture and grass-based systems in Ireland, but it's such a large part of Irish agriculture. It's so important, and where the challenges, there's also huge opportunities. And I think grassland agriculture can play an important part in meeting Ireland's commitments to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And I think some of the discussion we've had today has shown some of those potential solutions and how they might figure in the coming years. So thanks to everyone, and thanks to listening.